2 years ago, we cancelled the fourth of our Woman in Power speaker series events as London went into lockdown. So it gives me double the amount of pleasure to welcome all of you to Fenwick of Bond Street in the Octagon Room this evening. I am delighted to introduce to you the esteemed Jo Ellison, editor of Financial Times HTSI. Amongst her many accomplishments, she holds a master's in history. So it will be such a pleasure to hear you in conversation with the renowned classicist Mary Beard. 5 years ago, I read Mary's Woman in Power, a Manifesto. As I read her eloquent descriptions of the many ways that women's voices have been silenced from ancient history onwards, I was struck by the realization that in my profession of fashion, women are still always seen and never heard. Thus, Woman in Power inspired my fashion show in autumn-winter 2019, a 2-hour marathon of 35 powerful women orators of all disciplines. The original show is on our YouTube channel, and I'm so happy that some of those women are here with us tonight. Mary continues to inspire my practice as I seek to dress women with both femininity and power. It's such a privilege to hear your thoughts on the topic, the massive topic, of feminism then and now.
Hi everyone. I was saying earlier that we were looking at this topic, and it's like, right, I get Mary to talk for about 45 minutes, and we can hit around 1973, and I might throw in a quick Gloria Steinem, and then we can finish, because I have like no expertise in feminism now or then. But I'm hoping that Mary's going to sort of help fill in a lot of space and time. But Mary, this obviously, the book came about, the show was inspired by the book, which was inspired by a lecture that you were asked to do by the TLS, I think you just said.
London Review of Books.
London Review of Books, sorry. And I guess in terms of like what you were hoping to express with it at the time, what was the purpose and what was your ambition with it?
The true answer is I didn't have much ambition for it. That the London Review of Books runs this winter lecture series, and they said, would I do a lecture? And I think this was in 2014, and I said yes, but the trouble is when you say yes to giving a lecture, eventually someone says, well, what's the title? You know, and of course, if you haven't written it, you don't know what it's about. And so I kept procrastinating until the editor of the LRB, a great woman called Mary Kay Wilmers, said, look, we've got to get a programme out. What are you going to talk about? And I said, I don't know. And she said, all right, I'll give you a title then. You're going to talk about the public voice of women. And I said, fine, fine. And what happened then, I think, was that one part of me thinks that I'm just like a very good student, and really what I do is if somebody gives me a title, I'll write an essay, and that will be it. I'm just bad at thinking of the titles, quite good at writing the essay. But I think more really was that Mary Kay, who's a very good editor, showed that what good editors do for you is they tell you what you don't realise you want to talk about, even if you do. So I eventually began to warm to the task, and I thought, this is so interesting. And the lecture, like the book, starts with a passage from Homer's Odyssey, the second oldest work of Western literature. And I have read the Odyssey since because I was at a very swotty girls' school, and I've read it since I was about 15. And I teach it. And there is one passage in the beginning of the Odyssey, which I must have read hundreds of times, which I'd never noticed until I was preparing this lecture, which was story of Odysseus still coming back from the Trojan War. Penelope, his savvy wife, is at home. She's being pursued by these beastly suitors who want to marry her. and she keeps putting them off. There's one moment at the beginning of that book, which is the first book of the Odyssey, where Penelope comes downstairs. She's been weaving upstairs, and she hears a bard singing, and she realizes he's singing about what a terrible time the men like her husband are having getting back from the Trojan War. You know, this is composed in the 8th century BC. And she says to the bard, oh, you know, for crying out loud, can't you sing something nicer than that, a bit happier, a bit jollier? And her son, a weedy teenager, says to her, oh, mother, shut up. Speech is man's business. Go back upstairs. And she does. And in a way, that became the kind of template for the whole book, really, because I thought, blimey, women have, from the very origins of Western literature, women have been told to shut up, in this case, by their weedy teenage son. Right? And that is not only a kind of really big rooting of women's silence in Western literature. The other thing was I'd never noticed it. Right. You know, you read these things and you don't see the misogyny, sexism, something on the spectrum. You don't notice it. And, you know, in a way, this book is a tribute to the fact that about 40 years too late, I noticed what was going on.
And you were saying just a minute ago also that it was also an exercise in finding your own voice on a subject that wasn't necessarily something that felt like a natural arena for you. Because would you kind of identify as being a feminist kind of lecturer or someone who had a specific interest in kind of women in history?
I mean, in a way, the answer to that is yes, but what this did was it kind of allowed me to think from a different place about it. I wasn't teaching undergraduates. I was talking to a general audience, people I didn't know who was going to turn up. And I kind of felt that I'd got something to say about the long history of Western misogyny. And it was kind of liberating for me to, everywhere you look, as soon as you start to spot it, how do women talk? Oh, they're just like bloody animals. They yap and they squawk. People are saying that in the 7th century BC, and they're saying it in the 21st century AD. And some of these tropes about how women don't fit into the idea of the public voice that we think we have, are very, very old ones. We haven't invented the silencing of women. If anything, we've done a bit to challenge it. Not enough, but a bit. And I suddenly thought, right, this does all connect. What I do for my day job and this, it connects. And we're all implicated in it. I mean, I think I don't say in the book, but I will now confess. And I vividly remember the first time I got on a plane and we got to the bit where the pilot's supposed to come on and say, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, we'll be flying at 30,000 feet and there'll be a bit of turbulence at a certain point. And it was a woman's voice. And I remember, to my shame,
cringing with terror. No.
No, worse.
Rolling your eyes to heaven and going, oh, God.
Worse than that, really worse, and this is why it's a terrible confession, thinking, why is one of the cabin crew doing this announcement? Oh. And I mean, and it was only that split second. It was only, and I thought, no, my God, the pilot's a woman, right? This is what you want. But I was so conditioned to hearing that kind of voice as being a male voice that my first reaction was completely misprocess it.
I mean, in that idea that women's voices have kind of historically been suppressed or, undermined, in what circumstances do you think consistently do women's voices get amplified? Because otherwise it could be a bit of a sad old evening where we're like, yeah, suppressed for 2,000 years and it's never going to get any better.
I think women amplify their own voices within women's communities very well and very powerfully. And I think that gets put down. I mean, I think gossip is one of the best things that God ever invented. And if it's been taken over as a female form of discourse, I'm terribly pleased, but it's still a disempowered form of discourse.
It's a belittled form.
A belittled,
yeah.
You know, and I think that it is very hard to see, perhaps outside performance and music. You know, music. I suspect if we had we had some singers here, they would probably tell me I'm completely wrong, but I feel that there is a woman's voice that comes at me on the radio, which I have to take seriously in terms of song. But otherwise, I think that I think rather gloomily that women are silenced, and I think that the cartoon that I put at the front of the book it's an old Punch cartoon, and it shows an obviously kind of board meeting happening, and there's 6 or 7 blokes, and there's a woman, and the chair, who is of course a man, is turning to the woman and is saying, thank you very much, Miss Triggs. It's a great suggestion. Would one of the men like to make it now?
Right. Yeah.
And I have never met a woman who doesn't recognise that moment. You know, whether they're women in the academy, in journalism, on the shop floor, in school teaching, or whatever. Now, I'm not for a minute saying that women are the only silenced people in this country, or in the West. That's clearly not the case. But they, in a sense, share a particular version of silencing.
I mean, we're here ostensibly in the kind of context of a fashion conversation. Looking at a brand. I'd be interested to know what your perspective of whether women are empowered through their visibility, what they wear, or whether it can be this sort of, there's a terrible tension between being given the space and heralded for one's beauty or attractiveness or kind of classically sort of feminine values or whatever, and then being kind of castigated for it as well.
And that's always been the double bind of women, right back to the ancient Greeks and Romans. You want women to look nice, and then you blame them for looking nice.
And when they look nice and have quite interesting things to say, what happens in Greek?
I have to say that in terms of Greek and Roman male culture, you don't listen to them.
Right.
If they've got things to say, they're speaking out of turn. Now, what we don't know about the ancient world is whether there were countercultural communities of women who challenged that. Because if there were, and there might have been, they haven't gone into the literary tradition. And insofar as the literary tradition, going back to the ancient world, was preserved, in inverted commas, by a load of monks in monasteries, and they certainly didn't preserve the women's voices, did they, guys? No. So there's
no way to redress
But there is no way.
Yeah.
There is absolutely no way to redress the balance.
But in observing the kind of realities of the day, like when you're walking around somewhere like Pompeii and you're looking at kind of women's lives and to what extent they might have any degree of kind of relevance in terms of understanding how we are today, what are the kind of consistent themes that come up for you in terms of what women were doing, where their place in society was?
I suppose I think it's very depressing.
Oh God, this is going to be so grim. Okay,
but I will make it not depressed. But, I've lived through an absolute revolution in how women in history have been talked about. Mostly they are, mostly, not entirely, they're relatively elite white women, but there has been a revolution. So, same before, when I was a student in Cambridge, we did sometimes, because I was a women's college, we did sometimes do a little tiny bit of work on ancient women, but we always did it in the summer term when it didn't matter. It wasn't going to come up in the exam, that's for sure. Right? And that has completely changed. Women, the study of women used to, it could have been the study of beetles. It could have been, writing about insects in antiquity. It was women in antiquity, but it was all the basic. It was something insignificant in antiquity. And I think the first thing that happened, through my career was the people started saying, look, we do want to recreate women's lives. We want to think what they were doing when the guys were writing, etc., etc. And there was that got a little way. I mean, it started to refocus the lens. But eventually, if there are about 20 pages of ancient literature written by women and about 500,000 pages written by men, and there's not much you can do if that's the case. And I used to say to people, look, if you really want to if you want to study the women's experience, ancient history is a lousy place to start,
right?
Because you can't. What changed though, and you can see this. And you can predict this, I think, from the way different forms of literary and cultural feminism have gone, is that just before we all gave up and thought, oh well, we've only got Sappho. What else is there? Very interesting, but it's only a little bit. People started to see that if you couldn't recreate the place of women in the ancient world from their point of view, one thing that you'd been missing was the role of gender and gender difference as being absolutely central to what everybody, men particularly, obviously, what men wrote about. That Greek tragedy was not comprehensible unless you saw that at the foundation of Athenian culture, there was this actual kind of oppressive standoff between men and women. Clytemnestra, the errant, I'm putting that in inverted commas, wife of Agamemnon, another of the Greek heroes who go to fight in Troy, takes a lover while he's away, murders him when he comes back home. What ancient tragedians like Aeschylus in that case constantly returned to was the issue of how you place and understand women and gender difference in antiquity. And nobody had ever kind of said that before. Clytemnestra had just been a baddie, She murders her husband. That wasn't the right thing to do. We started to see that people were talking about what is it about the relationship between men and women that is so kind of edgy in Greek literature?
So it's always a point. It always tends to be a point of terrible friction.
It's a point of sometimes productive edginess, but often friction. And I think violence against women was something that, when I was a student, I was taught not to notice. I think, not to recognise. That one of the set texts that we read was Ovid's famous poem, The Metamorphoses, which is essentially, according to what the title, it's about people changing shape. It's about poor old Daphne being changed into a tree, etc., etc. It's actually about rape. It is 16 books of stories about rape. And when I look back to how I was taught that, we didn't even use the word rape. I remember we talked about all these heroines being ravished, as if somehow kind of they were having a good time, really. And took me, 20 or 30 years to open my eyes and to see that this was about one rape after the next. Now, sometimes my students now say, I don't want to read this. Why should I sit down and read, a textbook on rape? And while I find that, I want to say, look, we've got to look this in the eye. We've got to see that that's what classical culture was about. I at least give them the credit of having noticed what this damn book was about when I never did. And, we could have seen the Titian exhibition that happened just before lockdown at the National Gallery, the rape of Europa, etc., etc. And there is stories from Ovid which are putting on rich men's walls violence against women. And I still want to keep Titian on display in public galleries, but I want at least to title him right. I want to say, what is this?
Yeah.
And I think for me in doing classics over the last, 50 years, I guess, is that's been the big change, that I have the subject, but personally me, I've seen stuff, thanks to feminism, in classical literature, that when I was a kid, I just didn't notice. Nobody encouraged me to notice it. Now, when you've noticed it, you still got to decide what you're going to do with it, and how you're going to analyse it. But God, we've got to see it for what it is.
So when you are looking at history, it's not about necessarily finding the feminists, which I think is what we all desperately want to do.
We'd love to, yes.
But it's actually about putting a feminist lens on something and then understanding something through a context that helps us understand maybe how we are today. I mean, it's interesting you're talking about, the rape of many, many different women historically, and now we're looking at Ukraine and the kind of violence against women there, and how increasingly the UN are reporting this violence against women, and yet how hard it is to prove, how difficult it is to bring to court, that this, again, even within 2 months, has almost been mythologized as kind of folklore or something that is happening in a community, but no one really knows and there's no proof. And that will... And that's kind of been typical of all wars throughout all of time, is that the women get ravished and the men conquer.
And, the history of the weaponization of rape goes back as far as you can see in ancient warfare. But, it reminds me of a student's master's dissertation I've just been supervising, and this is a shout out to Isabel Clegg, because I'm using what she's just been writing her master's dissertation on. But this student of mine took a very famous scene from classical antiquity, where Scipio, one of the eventual conquerors of Hannibal in some bloody Roman war, is, as a prize of war, offered a young native, inverted commas, princess. He discovered that she was betrothed, and he says, no, I will have nothing to do with it. Give her back to her partner. And it's a scene that became incredibly popular in the Renaissance. And there is, hundreds of paintings of this scene known as the continence of Scipio. Scipio being a good boy.
Yeah, so his virtue and honour and
that's right.
Okay.
And what Isabel said when she was writing a dissertation is, this is the other side of martial rape. This is, a bloke getting praised over centuries for not raping somebody.
Yeah, right.
So how are we implicated in that? And it's spot on. And you can go to the National Gallery and you can see paintings of the continence of Scipio, and he sort of comes away with a pat on the back. Well, it is better, I suppose, than that he did. But the idea you get that you somehow become a kind of a moral hero of Renaissance right up to the 19th century, and now, as she pointed out, in our museum labels, sort of saying the same thing. That's how embedded this is, and that's how we don't notice.
But do we have moral heroines to look up to? I mean, it sounds like it's all a bit victimhoody and powerlessness. Are there not? There must be some women who we can look to think, yes, okay, this was a moral guide at least.
I think you can enjoy the fun of spinning the story.
Right.
I don't think that you can. Hypatia, who's played by Rachel Weisz, the 4th century AD philosopher. You can try. Most of them end up dead. I mean, I'm afraid most of the female voices who are speaking to us from antiquity end up nastily dead. What I think you can do, though, is that you can see the male stories about these women for what they are, and you can start to unpick that. And I think sometimes you find parallels with now. I mean, this audience looked largely too young to have enjoyed the BBC's I, Claudius when it was first shown in 1976, but it was a story of the first Roman emperors. And anybody who knows the tiniest bit about the first emperors of Rome knows that, of course, the women were the masterminds behind the throne. They were poisoning away to bring their favoured progeny up to the throne. They were kind of ruling the joint in a sinister way, using a combination of poison and sex
and gossip.
Poison, sex, and gossip. Yes, actually, you've got to add the gossip. And again, and I do feel I'm always late to the party on this kind of thing. It's taken us a very long time to see that construction of female misuse of power as an absolute traditional, male way of thinking about how women operate. And we,
And undermining their power.
And undermining them completely. And, whether Augustus's wife, Livia, brilliantly played by Sian Phillips, was, a toughie, or whether she was not a toughie, she has been constructed in a narrative of history which has gone on for 2,000 years as the woman who is the illegitimate use of power. And, you still see it now.
Well, Carrie Symonds,
a perfect
case.
I was going to say,
whispering away behind the scenes and,
that is exactly...
hosting her naughty parties.
That's right. And none of us have any idea, well, maybe some people here are much better connected than me, but I don't know what Carrie does. But I can see that she's the Livia character.
Yeah.
I can see that Sherry Blair was.
Yeah.
Nancy Reagan was. Do you remember? I mean, again, you do look mostly too young, but you remember how Nancy was supposed to kind of tell Ron what to do because he was a bit thick.
Yeah.
But she would do it by horoscopes and her all kinds of different versions of contacting the supernatural.
I suppose women have always got that woo-woo element, the strange spirituality.
Yeah.
Maybe it's Diana conversing with her seances and
That's
her.
right. And we never say that about Charles talking to trees.
No,
we just say he's a bit bats. But when it's Diana,
it's environmentalism. It's not
it's
woo-woo.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the patterns that have been set up for us to use to think with, they are not natural. They're just very, very deeply culturally ingrained,
So what hope is there for us? How are we going to break this cycle?
Well, I don't think I will live to see it, really.
I mean, now worse than ever, right? I feel as though we've gone so far backwards that I don't even know quite where we're going.
I think that... I can do the optimistic and the pessimistic.
Yeah, go on. Do some optimism. Why not?
Look, I've said, in classics, I've lived through a revolution. But I've lived through a revolution more generally about what women can or can't do. And, my mum was born before women had the vote in general elections. And by the time she died, she'd seen a woman prime minister. Now, she hated Margaret Thatcher, but she still thought that there'd been a change, the change that she wanted. And I think that's true for me. And I look at the working environment in which, I live my life. And, Cambridge has got a bloody long way to go still in all kinds of, accesses to, diversity of all sorts. But it's almost 50-50 male, female. And whereas I used to walk into the library that I mostly use, and it was all posh white men, it's now not all posh white men. They're not all white, and they're not all men, and they're not all posh. Now, there is, I would be the first to say that there's a hell of a lot more which requires doing. But when I think about how my working environment has changed, and what you can say, I think you read a hell of a lot in the papers about what you can't say in universities these days. There's a hell of a lot you can say that you didn't used to be able to say, and that's been a big change. I can say shut up and let a woman have a go, or I couldn't say that 40 years ago.
I mean, is it a lot of the time, is it about somebody sort of making sure there is that space, and when that person has repeated the male idea to say, and we kind of, it's up to other people to kind of reinforce the language around things.
And I think that happens, and I think it happens with disability. I mean, the idea that, I came to a university that had no handrails.
I suppose I find it slightly aggrieving that as a woman, or as someone who should be kind of empowering others who are a kind of disempowered social group, that it's sort of an obligation to lift people up, whereas a man can just rock up at university and do his thing and talk about what he wants. And so it's just that thing of do we have to be communal minded and helpful?
I don't know.
To be sisterly.
Depends whether I'm feeling nice or not. I mean, because I think the point of feminism is that it made things better for men, didn't it? I mean, I look at these guys and they're terrified. Some of them, they're shit scared. They might bluster. They might have been taught to disguise the fact they're shit scared, but they're still shit scared, that's the privilege of getting a bit older and looking at students. And many of my students would tell me, they sometimes feel intimidated by these blokes, they're coevals, because they're so confident,
right?
And that they feel that they don't belong, and I think. I see exactly what they mean, and I used to feel that. But I now know that those confident blokes are wetting themselves. Or some of them are. Enough of them are for it to make the point. I don't think absolutely every, there are some old Etonians who I don't think.
But it fascinates me that you were so nervous to speak out for so long, that you found it so hard to express yourself, or that you didn't feel that the environment was right. You seem you do seem very confident.
People used to say, and did at the time when I gave 2 lectures in there, so there's a bit funny. You're talking about women being silenced, and we haven't noticed you being silenced, darling. And women would say that perfectly reasonably. What is it? How can you talk about people being silenced except by speaking out? And if you're speaking out, you're not silenced. And I think that is a paradox. I think that. People are surprised when I say that for the first 20 or so years of my career, I didn't speak. You talked about fashion. I mean, the women, fashion and gossip, after these seminars where there was maybe 5 or 6 women and 25, 26 blokes. And, none of the women had ever said anything. We'd go off to the pub and we'd talk about how we might make this better, And, we did think maybe fashion would be helpful. There was one woman who sometimes did speak in these seminars, and she wore a fantastic gold bomber jacket. And we thought, maybe that's the answer.
So I just wear the right clothes.
Yeah, wear the right clothes and you'll be able to. I have to say, it never worked for me, right?
But I mean that.
But we went through all that, and it was a bit like the Miss Triggs moment in the cartoon that I used. You sat in these meetings, seminars, you knew you had something to say. I mean, it wasn't that you thought, oh, I haven't got anything to contribute here, but you could never get it in. It was as if they were happening in a language that was not yours.
Yeah.
And there were, I think a lot of people will recognise this, which is that if occasionally you did say something, more often than not, there would then be a kind of 15-second silence after you'd made your point, which would sound like forever in your head. And then some man would say, what I was trying to say was, as if you'd been entirely whited out.
Yeah.
And I felt a bit like that, in lectures. I wasn't very good at it. And I think that what I was doing all the time was I was trying to copy men. I was kind of looking at male lecturers or male interlocutors who I thought were clever, and I was trying to do that.
Right.
I was trying to kind of, ape them in some ways. And I think that, of course, is totally undermining, because you sort of feel you're acting. You say something, and when you listen to it in your head, it's as if somebody else is speaking. So you're always in a kind of parallel universe from where the discussion really is. As I say, I don't think it is only women who experience this, but I experienced it as a woman. And I think that the one thing that changed for me, and I don't know how it changed, or if I did, I would tell you, was that I gave up trying to speak like a man. And I thought, I suspect some people think I do speak like a man, but I gave up trying to do that. And I thought, I'm going to say what I want to say in my words, and then that will be me. And if it falls flat, it falls flat. But I'm not pretending to be someone else.
Yeah.
And I think that carried through for me very well to telly, because when I didn't do any television until I was in my mid-50s, and I just about with a gin and tonic I can watch myself on telly, just about. But one thing I recognise is I can think sometimes it's not very good, sometimes I think it's good, but it's always me. I recognise myself.
You are your authentic self.
I am my authentic self. I think when you put it like that, it sounds like a bloody cliche, but it's sort of. I hear myself in my head. I don't hear me trying to pretend to be somebody else. And, then I go off script and I don't get it right. And then I fumble. Yeah. And then someone says, well, what I was trying to say was,
Yeah.
It's only because somehow I was encouraged. And I don't know who did it. I was emboldened to follow my own instincts.
I'd love to ask whether anyone has any questions, but before I do, I was going to ask you also, on the flip side of that, having a voice in a public sphere, you have been a recipient of incredible criticism, and that's something that women I think deal with very, very badly. They're very likely to shut down, not kind of engage any further, stop communicating. They can be cowed very, very quickly. How do you cope with it, and what's your best advice for when you get shouted down in the meeting or whatever happens?
I think you're right. I think that women and people of colour in particular, but there are other groups, have such a really differentially bad time. When I look at what Diane Abbott gets on Twitter, it is so disgraceful. I suppose that my only advice, Well, my only advice is you have to do what makes you feel comfortable. You know, there's no. It's a bit like kind of not copying what somebody else does. There's no right way of dealing with people being horrible, ridiculously horrible on social media. The standard advice that I was always given was block them and pay no attention. And I found that quite awkward to do in the end, because I thought, look, that's just another way of silencing women. You know, that's leaving the bullies in charge of the bloody playground, isn't it? You know, they abuse me, and all I do is block them, and they go on saying it. It's just I don't hear it. So, for some people that might be right, and I think you shouldn't kind of be prescriptive for other people. But I just found that when people said things that were just wrong, and I certainly haven't always got this right, by any means. When people said things that were just wrong, I wanted to say, I'm sorry, that's not right. I didn't say that.
So you engage with that?
I just engage. No, again, it would be really, really wrong to say, you know, every time you engage with someone, you have a miraculous conversion of the other person. That does not always happen. It perhaps doesn't often happen. It happens often enough.
And I think also there's that idea, like, you know, the impression I think we might have given is that men and women sit in this kind of terrible, kind of like oppositional, adversarial, and actually, obviously, a lot of stuff is just good dialogue, and you've got to have a conversation to get to a point of disagreement, maybe. But
you've got to learn how to disagree without actually,
martyring them or whatever it is.
Right. And it's not, not all the Twitter abuse is done by men.
No, God no. Women being nasty to women is one of the most depressing things.
Yes, it is. But I'll just finish with one lovely little anecdote, which is kind of restoring faith in human nature. It was when I was getting in a storm about saying that there were people of colour in Roman Britain, which is obviously true, though it doesn't go down very well amongst certain, right-wing groups and others, I think. And somebody said something I thought really stupid. And so I tweeted back and I said, look, that isn't what I said, and you can't, you have to think more carefully about what's typical and what's not typical. It was a careful reply, never get cross. That is a piece of advice, never get cross. He then replied and said, thank you so much for replying.
Oh, there you go.
I'm
blown away.
I was a policeman, I'm a retired policeman, and I've just had a heart bypass operation.
He said, don't be mean to me, else I'll die on you.
But I'm reading a lot of history. And actually, we meet in our local pub, it's in Glasgow, we meet in the pub on a Tuesday night and we talk history. And if you're ever in Glasgow on a Tuesday, come and see us. And I thought, I don't think we've got that much in common, but if you can, you can't say fairer than come and meet us in the pub on a Tuesday night in Glasgow, and we can go on talking.
Go on talking. Anyone have any questions? I'd love to hear. Yes, hand at the back there.
I didn't quite. I heard it about Roe v. Wade, but what was the precise question? Oh, you got a microphone is coming.
What do you think?
What do I think? Oh God! The pessimism or the optimism? I don't know. I think that I do think that the setbacks that we have, and we have some, are never putting us back to where we were before. So I do think that although the progress towards proper women's rights isn't just a beautiful upward curve, it's a bit like that, I think it's going in the right direction, and I think it's still well. That's the optimist. I think it's horrible, and I think it's, an absolute classic example of the state debating itself on the body of women. That is what women are that is what always happens, that women's bodies are, is that... Yes, currently we are. I don't... my optimistic projection here is that we will never go as far backwards as I remember, and we will go forwards again. And so it's
my life has been.
Yeah, it is.
I'm going backwards. It's my small world opinion, but what someone like you, what's your opinion about this? I mean, for me, is, I have my best friend is 65 and he's a man, and has a family, and he lives in Miami, and he's a music producer, and I wrote him the other day, and he said, "Oh my God, Caro, you don't know what it means to wake up in a world where abortion has just been accepted in 13 countries, in 13 states. In my country, it's like going for me backwards. And that's a man who's 65 years old, and he tells me
Of course I think it's backwards. If you're asking me to take the long view, I hope that it's not backwards forever.
No.
But I mean, I suppose my view would be that I'm as worried about the privilege involved. We all know
the what? Sorry.
The privilege we know who will escape this. We know that rich women will be inconvenienced, but they will still get their abortions. And so it's the combo of poverty and gender.
Yes, no, we will have that.
I'm going to ask also for the next question. Sorry, because there's a few hands up. So if you don't mind sharing the mic a bit,
It's a bit of a devil's advocate question. At what point do you think we'll be ready to raise the feminist debate into a humanist one? So you mentioned about the kind of the aping of lecturers and such like. I run and own a business, and quite a lot of the problems that I see are women putting those problems on themselves, because it's not a man who's saying, emulate me, be like me in a meeting, etc., etc. But all too often I'm interviewing women who are putting a lot of these rods on backs. And what would your advice be to women in terms of other women to help relieve or alleviate that problem? And at what point does that sense of self-responsibility come in?
I think it's very hard, and I think that my own, what was my career? Who helped my career? Well, in part, I was at a women's college, and I was helped by women teachers who, it was tough love, fucking hell, but it was, really important. And I hope I've done a bit of the same. I think, you never quite know, do you? I think that all women put a lot of burdens on themselves. You never see in a reference for a job about a male candidate. He's been really helpful to junior men, right? Though that's commonly comes out, and so we're bound together in some ways in this this cycle of mutual dependence. Part of that is great. I've been a huge beneficiary of that. But in the end, it's a vignette of the powerlessness. It's that we need to, the women are expected to go the extra mile to help. Women of colour in Cambridge, I think, have, that's trebly the case, and but saying, I suppose I was told to toughen up a bit. I suppose some of the tough love I got from my teachers was stand on your own 2 feet, but they didn't really mean it, I don't think, and I think it's very, very hard. And what would it look like? What will it look like when we've won? That's what I wonder.
The back.
Hi, thanks very much. Really lots of fascinating insights. Just to take you back to your particular field, I wondered if you had any insight as to why so many classicists are women these days, not just you, but Bettany Hughes, Edith Hall, Daisy Dunn, Natalie Haynes. I could go on.
Yeah.
Bettany Hughes, I think I meant to say.
Yeah.
So first of all, why do you think it's happened? And secondly, what effect has it had on the actual teaching of the classics and our interpretation of them?
Might I hazard that they're a bit younger than you, some of them? Do you think
Edith
you've been
is a little bit. Yeah, they're all younger
Do you think
than
maybe
me. They're
they've
all
all
young. They're all
followed
younger
Mary?
than me.
They've seen Mary on the telly, and now they want to do the same thing.
I think if you said that to Edith Hall, she would object.
I don't know. It's got to be a factor, surely, like being in a public sphere talking about the ancient world, surely. It means women can think of doing it.
Clearly, that in part that's the case. It's the old role model argument is one that we shouldn't knock. I think, however, that it's interesting that of the people you mentioned, it's only Edith Hall who has a full-time academic job. And I think that the cultural creative sector, because you could move on to people like Madeline Miller or whatever, have really, Charlotte Higgins, have really opened up different ways of what it was to study antiquity. If you go to universities and who they're hiring, they're doing better. But, for several years, I was the only woman in my faculty in Cambridge, and there's now about 8, but there's about 26 men. And I think that the academic profession as an academic profession has been slower to catch up. But I think that simply, if you ask people to name a classicist now, you're right. From people who are in some ways active in the public sphere are, they would almost all be women. And I think they are both changing the field, and they're a beneficiary of the way that the field had changed, so that they felt that there was a place for them to do what they wanted to do. So I think it's always very kind of intersecting, probably. But it's great, and fiction has had a huge amount to do with this. Fiction both by men and women. And Robert, I wrote my PhD thesis on Cicero, and I never managed to convince anybody that Cicero was remotely interesting. And Robert Harris comes along and writes a trilogy about him, and everybody thinks he's sexy.
I think we've got time for one more. Yeah, the back there.
Thank you. As you rightly illustrated, women were, frankly, severely oppressed in the ancient world. Have you come across in your studies something which you could describe as the genus of female power in society? For example, as you said, in literature, women are very, very badly treated in Greek literature. Perhaps in the religious world, where they began to build a power base in society.
I think you have to, if you're looking at the ancient world, religion would be one place to go, perhaps the only place to go. And there has been quite a lot of attempts to, in a sense, to see priestesses, etc., as being, at least a seed of that. And also there have been attempts to see female divinities and deities as that. And as a plug, you can go and see the Feminine Power exhibition at the British Museum, which has got religious women from all over the world. I think and yes, the answer to that must be yes, I think, but rather less than one would like. And I remember, thinking a lot when I was a graduate student, actually, because I worked on ancient religion, like the figure of Athena, you know, the patron goddess of Athens. You know, and there's a basic problem here. So if Athens is a exclusionary male society, which effectively has women veiled and confined to the home, how the hell, you know, what on earth are they doing with a female goddess as you know, as their brand? And, you know, that's one of the, I suppose, one of the ways that we focused on thinking about gender. And, of course, the more you look at Athena, the more you see that she isn't a woman anyway. You know, goddesses are not women. You know, what does she wear? She wears armour, right? She's holding a spear, she's got a helmet, and she was born out of the head of her dad, right? You know, everything about Athena is, I am not woman, though I look like I might be. And you push these kind of apparent nexuses of female power in the ancient world, and they all crumble a little bit, like Athena. However, I think that the sort of debates that they bring up and the way they were debated shows you that, let's say, 5th century Athens was worried about gender, you know, and I'm sort of old-fashioned enough to think that nobody oppresses anybody else without worrying about it a bit. And the ancient world would be a good example of that. You know, they're going on about women all the time, right? Because
they're busy telling their mums to shut up.
They're busy telling their mums to shut up.
Must
right,
have a factor.
You know? But I think it's you know, there is a way in which oppression takes a hell of a lot of cultural energy to justify. And of course that enables us to come in and rewrite the story.
Well, thank you very much. That was brilliant. Thank you.